as features of social communication in the context of its effectiveness at work. And there are, to be honest, two aspects I would like to share with you today. So first of all, I would like to tell you about a short characteristics of possible communication partners, because we may think that people are the same all the time, but it is not true. So it is sometimes very wise to know the differences between them. And mainly that is the first part I would like to deal with you today. The second part will be some hints on how to make our communication process more effective. And I will try to list some hints and recommendations. And you will recognize that the hints are very universal. So it is not only to be used when we know that our group may contain some special individuals, but just for everyone, it would be useful to use them. So let's start. Only a few words about my background, because it may give you some idea why it is so important to me, I mean the topic. Well, first of all, I am a teacher at the University of Warsaw, which means that I deal with students who are adult people. And because, as all of us, I have to run some classes with them, I notice that people react, understand my speech in a different way. And the second field, the second group of my listeners are secondary school students, because I am also a teacher at school. So I run classes with teenagers, and I also notice that some of these people may have some difficulties. So the experience on the first ground, which is University of Warsaw and then school, caused or helped me to make some observations and ask some questions. And mainly the observations and questions are related to some quite obvious facts. So first of all, we all know that the groups of people we deal with are not homogeneous. So generally people are just different. So in every group of people, people will be different. They are, I mean, the people are of different social and educational background. Some of them may behave differently while communicating. Some of them may be shy. Some of them may have some problems to read something if we show the slide. So they just behave differently while communicating. Some of them may have problems to concentrate. So generally, some people have problems while communicating. What was the most surprising to me was the conclusion that there are some situations in which I also have problems. And probably that was the thing that surprised me the most. So originally, I noticed that while working with students, when I was just using textbooks of English with the students, but it also sometimes happens when I am on the conference and there is some presentation and there is some slideshow. And some types of slides are organized in a way which makes it quite difficult to catch the main idea, to guess what the person is trying to tell us about. So the basic question is, why is it like this? Why are there some groups of people who have communication problems, and why there is me who have no such problems, but still have difficulties sometimes with understanding the speech or the presentation. So let's start with the thing which is probably the reason of the problems of some groups of students and adult people and teenagers and kids, because the group of those who suffer from these problems can be quite big. Well, the majority of the problems can be related to something that is called developmental disorders. Well, when I was giving the lecture for the first time for Ukrainian listeners, somebody told me that it is not that common in Ukraine to talk about mental disorders. And I started thinking about that. I must say that here in Poland, although we have some background, although we have some institutions that help such people, I must admit that the majority of people, especially the majority of teachers, they theoretically they know that the problems exist, but if we ask them the questions how to deal with such kids, probably they will have some problems with answering how. So that means that on one hand, people realize the existence of developmental disorders. On the other hand, they just don't know what to do with such people. So let's start with some short characteristics of developmental disorders. So first of all, a developmental disorder is a group of conditions that is caused by an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. These conditions begin during the developmental period, so quite early, and may impact day-to-day functioning. They can last through a person's lifetime. And this is very important because they start when the person is quite young, so probably in a childhood. And sometimes we can help the person, but very often the person cannot be cured because these are just developmental disorders. The effects of almost all developmental disorders can be reduced, as I said, if the person is under some kind of treatment. The disorders may be mild and easily manageable with some behavioral and educational interventions, or they may be more severe and affect children in a way that the children will require more support. What are the examples of developmental disorders? So first of all, they are neurodevelopmental disorders, and some scientists prefer calling them like that. But generally, in the group of these disorders, there are attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, which is called ADHD. There is autism spectrum disorder. And there are some learning disabilities, such as dyslexia and impairments in other academic areas. And there are also some intellectual disabilities. Of course, the list is longer, but these are the most, I don't want to say popular, but they happen probably the most often. Why is that problem important? Well, the answer is quite easy. First of all, that is because such people just surround us. They are almost everywhere. Because these developmental disorders usually don't require any special treatment, they attend our workplaces, they attend our universities, they attend schools. So as I said, almost everywhere. And probably each of us can list some people suffering from developmental disorders because we just know or met such people. And because they have some problems, the problems influence communication process we take part in as teachers, as colleagues at work, and just as ordinary people on the street. And if we don't realize the existence of such people and the existence of developmental disorders, we may sometimes unconsciously and unintentionally harm other people and make their life more difficult. But if we understand the problems, we may make the communication process better and more efficient because it is not difficult. So there is just a list of some hints, some recommendations, and if we remember the hints and recommendations, we really can help the people and help ourselves. So today I would like very, very shortly just to give the examples of characteristics of the most often, once again, I don't want to say the most popular, but the most often occurring developmental problems, which would be dyslexia, ADHD, and Asperger syndrome. So let's start with dyslexia. That is a problem which is a disorder involving some specific difficulties in reading and writing. And it is very important to emphasize that together with these difficulties in reading and writing, there is a simultaneous normal mental development. So there are no mental problems at all. Developmental dyslexia is of neurobiological origin and is characterized by inadequate facilities in language processing. And these problems in language processing, they are manifested in decoding and encoding difficulties. Among the most common causes of dyslexic reading problems is poor word identification ability, which means that those who suffer, so dyslexics, they have problems with identifying the words and the letters. This is caused by print decoding impairments and is heavily related to phonological awareness. And there are also other cognitive deficits which can be seen in dyslexics. For example, deficits in the short-term or working memory, slow processing, and incomplete automatization. And if we realize these problems, we really can influence our way of communicating with the people. What is also important in relation to is that dyslexia can be combined with some other behavioral problems. For example, it can be combined with dysphasia, which is a speech developmental disorder in children. It can be combined with dyscalculia, so problems with mathematics. It can be dyspraxia, so it is a lack of physical coordination. These can be problems related to keeping track of time. So sometimes for such people, it is just complicated to understand when there is the end of the time for completing some tasks. So if we tell them you have 5 minutes to do that, it can be problematic for dyslexics to understand when the 5 minutes finish. And these can also be some problems with hyperactivity or attention disorders. What is important is the fact that symptoms of dyslexia change with time, but they don't disappear. The diagnosis is the easiest in young kids because they have the biggest range of symptoms. But with time, it becomes more difficult as the scope of dyslexia symptoms change. So there are not only orthographic mistakes, but they can be accompanied with emotional and motivation problems that didn't occur in younger kids. So generally, the conclusion is that dyslexia doesn't disappear, but the older the person, the better he or she is in choosing different strategies of overcoming dyslexic problems. But as I said, it doesn't mean that the problems disappear. So more or less, that would be all about dyslexia. The second neurological developmental disorder is ADHD. The abbreviation comes from the American name, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And it is also a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is characterized by severe and impairing difficulties with sustained attention, with restless overactivity and impulse control. And there are 3 keywords that would characterize ADHD. So first of all, it is inattention, which means a person wanders off task, lacks persistence, has difficulty sustaining focus, and generally is disorganized. And these problems are not due to defiance or lack of comprehension. The second keyword, which is related to ADHD, is hyperactivity. And hyperactivity means a person seems to move about constantly, including in situations in which it is not appropriate. Or the person may excessively fidget, tap, or talk all the time. And in adults, extreme restlessness or wearing others out with constant activity. So generally, the person cannot keep calm, just stay in one position. They need to do something all the time. And the last keyword is impulsivity. It means that a person makes hasty actions that occur in the moment without first thinking about them. So they act and only then think about what they did. And that may have a high potential for harm or a desire for immediate rewards or inability to delay gratification. And such an impulsive person may be socially intrusive and excessively interrupt others or make important decisions without considering the long-term consequences. It should be said that in the literature, you can find information about critical attitude towards ADHD, because there are some groups of scientists who think that ADHD as a disorder doesn't really exist. So they have some arguments against ADHD. So the first group of scientists who are opponents of ADHD, they say that ADHD is only a medical excuse for bad behavior of kids and teenagers and parents or adults' inability to control and limit it. Because those who are diagnosed with ADHD, very often they just behave in an improper way. And as I said, some scientists think that it is not that there is something wrong with the kid. The problem is in parents who just cannot control the behavior of the kid and don't know the tools, don't know how to react to, how to stop the kid. The second group of opponents of ADHD say that this disorder is strongly linked to medical business. Why do they think so? It is because, especially in the United States of America, those who are diagnosed with ADHD very often are prescribed quite strong medical treatment. So they just need to take medications. And because medical market earns a lot of money, some of the scientists suspect that that is the reason why ADHD is diagnosed that often, because it is just related to the medical market. And the last group of doctors, of scientists, they say that ADHD is just a lie. But still, it exists in developmental classifications. So for now, we should treat it as the existing problem. And it affects 5% of school children. So that means that quite a big group of school children is affected with that. And what is important, ADHD cannot be cured, but symptoms of that can be softened and additional problems can be prevented. So once again, a special treatment is needed, and then we can somehow cope with the problems. Probably I should also say that quite often it turns out that if a person is dyslexic, he or she also suffers from ADHD, because it is proved that there is a coexistence of ADHD and dyslexia. So what are the symptoms? I will concentrate on the symptoms of adult people, because that is the target group you deal with, probably university students and just colleagues at workplace. So the symptoms are as follows. Mostly it is a carelessness and lack of attention to detail. So for such people, it is quite complicated to concentrate on something which is detailed. Continually starting new tasks before finishing old ones. So they start something, they will not finish that and just start another thing. Poor organizational skills, inability to focus or prioritize, continually losing or misplacing things. So in case of such people, it is quite important to think about one place to put the things and to help them in such a way. I will be talking about that later. Forgetfulness, restlessness, and edginess. So as I said, they need to move all the time. It can be difficulty keeping quiet and speaking out of turn. We all know probably the people who at some meetings, they just want to say something, want to add something. So not all of them, of course, but some of them may be sufferers of ADHD. Blurring out responses and often interrupting others. So the first impression is that is the person who wants to be in the center of attention, but that might be a ADHD sufferer. Mood swings, irritability and a quick temper, inability to deal with stress, extreme impatience, and taking risks in activities. So some of them, they take risks, they don't think about the consequences, they just need some energy, some activities of that type. And that is the second group of the people we may deal with, we may meet during our students' classes at the university or workplace. And there is also the third group, from my point of view, the most interesting. And at least here in Poland, quite a lot of people are diagnosed with it. There are also some people who are even too often diagnosed. But as I said, it is becoming quite popular. And it is quite important to understand the problem, because we may meet such people everywhere. And the developmental disorder I am talking about is called Asperger syndrome. And Asperger syndrome is a previously used diagnosis on the autism spectrum. So it is related to autism spectrum disorder. In 2013, it became part of an umbrella diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and it is placed in Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it is called a DSM-5 in there. Today, Asperger's syndrome is technically no longer a diagnosis on its own. It is now part of a broader category that can be called autism spectrum disorder. And this group of related mental health issues shares some symptoms. So even so, lots of people still prefer to be using the term Asperger's or Asperger's syndrome. The condition is what doctors call a high functioning type of ASD, so autism spectrum disorder. This means that the symptoms are less severe than other kinds of autism spectrum disorder. And what is important for us from the point of view of communication with some people is that in case of Asperger's syndrome, the verbal language skills and intellectual ability distinguish them from other types of autism. So generally, their verbal language skills and intellectual ability develops, and there are no problems with that. Asperger's syndrome is a neurobiological disorder that causes deficiencies in social skills, such as difficulty in communication and changing the routines. And that is something that can be very interesting for us. What is more, they suffer from some social deficiency, limited interests, obligatory behavior with no verbal communication problem. And as it was in the case of dyslexia and in case of ADHD, Asperger's syndrome cannot be prevented or treated, but with time, Asperger's learn how to compensate their deficits. So if they were born like that, they will be like that through the lifetime. And let's have a look at the most important problems related to Asperger's syndrome. There is the group of signs of it, and all of them may influence our communication with such people. So, first of all, Asperger's syndrome sufferers, they have difficulty with social communication and interaction. So sometimes if we try to say something to such a person, he or she may react in a strange way. So it may seem to be a strange reaction. They are suffering from hypersensitivity to sensory assault. So all the sounds, all the noises, they may distract them. They extremely focus on specific topic of interest. I remember one of my students, it turned out later that he was an Asperger's syndrome sufferer, who during the lessons, he was focused on, I don't remember what the topic was, probably it was something related to the architecture of London. And at the very beginning, it was quite interesting because this boy, he wanted to say as much as possible about that. So he was focused on that topic. He knew a lot and he wanted to make presentations about them. But then it turned out that it becomes problematic because it was quite difficult for me to make him stop talking about architecture of London, or to let him join the conversation, I mean, to let other students join the conversation. That means that such people can focus in an unnatural way on one topic, and it is very difficult to make them stop talking about that. Another problem is difficulty with changes in routines. This is very important, and this is something we do not really realize. So let's imagine the situation at the university that we have our classes every Monday in room number 5. And suddenly somebody comes and says that there is some problem with Windows, for example, and we need to change today, this Monday, we need to change this room and go to room number 10, let's say. For the majority of our students, it is not a problem. They just pack their things, take their bags and go to room number 10. But for Asperger's ones, it would be a very, very huge challenge because this is a change in their routines. So they act according to some routines. They know that on Mondays at this time, we are in room number 5. And now the change, such a simple and small change, changes their everyday routine. They also have problems with empathy. They just don't understand the reactions of some people, of other people. They just don't know. They cannot understand the background of the behavior of them. So they understand what they see, but they cannot analyze the reasons. And the last one is engaging in stereotype repetitive behaviors. So very often they want to repeat some activities, they want to repeat some actions because they are linked to stereotypes, to repetitive behaviors. So that is also linked to these examples, the example with changing the rooms. If we analyze the strengths and challenges which are typical for Asperger's syndrome sufferers, we should list the following. So first of all, when talking about strengths, they are very good when talking about focus and persistence. So they can focus and they are very persistent. So another strength is aptitude for recognizing patterns, and they pay attention to details. But there are also quite a lot of challenges. First of all, they are, as I said, hypersensitive to light, to sound, to tastes. So if in our university room there is some problem with the light, so it turns on, it turns off, or makes some sounds, for the majority of people, it will be something they will not notice, but our Asperger syndrome one will definitely have problems with that, probably will not be able to concentrate. They may have difficulty with the give and take of conversation, so it is quite difficult for them to make any compromise. They have difficulty with non-verbal communication skills, like distance, like loudness, like tone, because they don't really understand them. So they cannot use them as they don't understand them. They may make many uncoordinated movements, and they may be clumsy. And a characteristic problem for them is anxiety and depression, because they can be very depressive. And that's the group of our listeners. So let's imagine that we have the group of students, and there are a few dyslexic people, there is some Asperger syndrome sufferer, there is somebody suffering from ADHD, and of course there is the group of people who do not suffer from anything. So our question is, how can we make our communication more effective? Even if we don't know the group, we don't know who will listen to us, we should make an assumption that in such a group there are those who will be suffering. And now I would like you to have a look at some hints of what to do. As I said at the beginning, you will realize that the hints are universal. So they are good not only for dyslexics, they are good not only for ADHD ones or Asperger syndrome ones, but they are good for everybody because they make our process, our work, our presentations, our materials that we prepare for students, they make them just better. And let's start with dyslexics and the hints that can be or should be related to documents and presentations. Due to the difficulties that are encountered by dyslexic students, definitely some recommendations have been drawn up to help them perceive information better. What are the hints? First of all, it is advised that we should use large spaces between words and that the words should be displayed in an appropriate font. For dyslexic students, the best font to be used is not Times New Roman, which is probably the most popular, but it is Arial or Comic Sans, because they ensure good legibility and they are just easier for dyslexics to perceive, to read. It should be remembered that text that is presented in one big block is illegible for people with dyslexia. So it should be broken up, maybe not so, and it should be broken up with illustrations. And the problem with illustrations is more complex because we should also remember that if we use too many illustrations in our materials, it may be a kind of a distractor for dyslexic students. So just a good idea is to use a few illustrations, but not too many, because they just help if they are not overused. A text intended for reading should not be printed densely, so there should be some spaces. Sentences and titles written in capital letters should be avoided. So we just should not use capital letters because then words run into each other because they start and end at the same height, and it is not good for dyslexic students. Presentation slides that are prepared for people with dyslexia should be devoid of unnecessary words, but should contain bullet points instead of sentences, should contain charts, diagrams, and colored background. That is quite important. So if you look at my presentation, you will see that the background of the presentation is not white. It is rather cream, I would say, and that is what is advised because the contrast is not that big. I use black letters, and that is probably the most often situation. So if the background is white, then the contrast is bigger. Here, black letters on creamy background just make better impression, and they are just more friendly for dyslexics. It is also advised to choose the colors of materials to reduce contrast. That's what I already said, so it is quite important. The paper, this advice should be cream or a natural shade of white, but not snow white. It can be matte, and in addition, thick enough so that print from the other side does not show through. Of course, it is related to textbooks, to something that we print, that the paper should be thick enough as not to have the print from the opposite side seen on the first side. Light text should not be put on a darker background. The text should not be surrounded by complicated graphic elements. So I said that charts, that diagrams are advised to use, but they should not be that complicated. So they should be rather simple and prepared in a way that is easy for dyslexic people to understand. It is very important because dyslexic people learn visually and they absorb material without finding links in it on a random basis. If we make presentations just keeping to the hints that I have already listed, then probably we will be quite successful. I will add here that here in Poland, there is a very popular scientist called Marta Bogdanowicz. She's a professor at the University of Gdańsk, and she is very active in the Polish Society of Dyslexics. She has a dyslexic daughter too, and the majority of the books that she writes, they are printed or a cream paper, so not white paper, but cream white. And this is given as the example of a good advantage and making just the books more available and more friendly for dyslexic users. When talking about school and university, there are also some hints which can be very useful, and it is good to remember about them. So if it happens that we have at school some dyslexic students or at university some dyslexic listeners, we should remember not to criticize them, but praise instead. A person with dyslexia needs a boost to their self-confidence before they can learn to overcome their difficulties. They often don't believe that they are capable of learning, so that is why it is good not to criticize, but just to say that they are good at something, to praise them. It is important to reestablish their self-confidence because they don't have so many chances to do that. The second important rule is not to ask a person with dyslexia to read aloud. If you ask such a person to read aloud, it is rather obvious that the person will have problems with it. And if it happens in the group of other students or school students, then it will be quite frustrating for such a person. So it is just better not to ask the person to read aloud. We can think about some other activity to check what we want to check, or we may ask the person to stay a bit longer. When there are no other people around, then we can ask the person to read aloud, but only to us. Don't use the word lazy when talking about such a person. People with dyslexia, they have to work harder to produce a smaller amount. So they will have difficulty staying focused when reading, writing, or listening, but it doesn't mean that they are lazy. So it is just better to forget about that word when we have the contact with dyslexic person. Expect less written work. It is also related with the fact that they have problems with writing. So a person with dyslexia may be verbally bright, but struggle to put ideas into writing. So it is quite wise to allow, first of all, more time for reading, listening, and understanding. Another rule is to prepare a printout of homework. So in case of dyslexic people, it is not enough to say complete task number 2 or task number 3. It is also quite wise to write it down somewhere on a blackboard or just give a printout of homework, so just print on a paper. And it would be quite wise to provide numbered steps. For example, number 1, do this. For example, number 1, read text on page 6. Number 2, answer the questions which are given below in exercise 5. So if we show the steps, we can be more sure that the person completes the task. Another rule says not to ask the people with dyslexia to copy text from a board or book. Definitely, what is advised is to give a printout, so to print the information. We can suggest the dyslexic person highlights key areas and draws thumbnail pictures in the margin to represent the most important points. Just when copying the text from a blackboard, they may make some mistakes, and some words can be skipped or some parts can be skipped, and we will not get the result we are expecting. Another rule says that we should accept homework created on a computer. Because the people with dyslexia, they have problems with handwriting. Sometimes it may turn out that just physical handwriting is a kind of torture for most of them. So why not to suggest they write the same, but on a computer? Don't know how it is in Ukraine, but in Poland, for example, if the secondary school students have a special certificate confirming their dyslexia, they are given in some severe cases, they are given the right to write the final exams at the end of the secondary school on the computer. That is because handwriting is problematic for them. Another rule says that we should discuss an activity to make sure it is understood. So once again, it is not enough to say complete exercise number 2 on page 6, but we should try to visualize the activity or link it to a funny action that may help someone with dyslexia remember. Okay, so definitely we should also try to explain the task. The next one says that we should give the opportunity to answer questions orally. Often people with dyslexia can demonstrate their understanding with a spoken answer, but are unable to put those ideas in writing. So sometimes it is just better to ask some questions and not to tell them to write something, because when giving oral answers, it may turn out that they are very efficient. Another rule says that we should make written material dyslexia friendly. So if we use a proper background of our materials, if we use a proper font, a proper spacing, then our materials will become dyslexia friendly. And the last one says that we should use and encourage dyslexic people to use useful strategies. For example, mind maps, spider diagrams, highlighter pens, a ruler under a line of text. All these things can be just helpful to dyslexic people. We may also meet such people at work, dyslexic people. So when talking about written communication, there are some hints that can make this written communication just better and easier. For example, it is advised to give verbal as well as written instructions. So you can see that it is somehow similar to the rules for secondary school students and academic students, just verbal and written instructions. We should consider assistive technologies such as screen readers, scanning pens, text-to-speech or mind mapping software. So definitely there is a software assisting such people. So if the problem is serious, we can think about such a device. We should provide all hard copy resources on colored paper. And of course, we should, before doing that, we should find out which color helps the person to read best. We should highlight key points in documents. So why not to use the highlighter? We can do that. We can just underline, highlight the key points. We should allow plenty of time to read and complete the task. We should use different formats to convey information, or use a digital recorder to record meetings. Of course, not always it is possible, but if it is, then definitely it would be a good idea to record the meeting or training, just to give the listeners the chance to listen to that for the second time. And because they have problems with writing, we should not ask them to minute a meeting. It is not a good idea. When talking about their verbal communication, it is advised to communicate instructions slowly and clearly, and to minimize distractions and check if the person understood what we were talking. So slow and clear instructions. We should try to support important communications by supplying the information in more than one format, for example, verbally, and using hard copy resources. We should try to minimize distractions. We should try to encourage note-taking, but note-taking only for the person, not on some documents. And of course, if it is possible, we should use recorders just to record the meeting. And the last one is also related to computer work and to some other areas of activity. So when talking about computer work, we should change background color of screen to suit individual preferences. It is related to the things I told about background of presentation. So the same about computer screens. Why not to change background color? Of course, according to individual preference. We can supply anti-glare screen filters, and we should allow frequent breaks at least every hour. So just to let such people make breaks, probably as often as it is needed, but not at least once an hour. And there are some other ideas. So we should reduce distractions for focused tasks. So, for example, the person should sit away from doors, from noisy machinery, because it just distracts the person. We should ensure that work areas are organized, are neat and tidy. We should ensure the team returns important items to the same place each time. That is quite important. It's also related to ADHD workers. So if we take the thing from one place, we should put this thing back in the same place as to keep some order. And of course, we should ensure work areas are well lit. More or less, these are the most important hints related to dyslexic people. As you can see, especially the last ones about an organized area, working area, making it neat and tidy. These are the rules which are very useful for everybody, not only for dyslexic people. Let's have a look at the second group of our possible listeners, so ADHD ones. The list here is very short because their problems are more or less related to some hyperactivity, so we cannot do much about that. But definitely what we can do in case of ADHD people is that we can divide the work into short time units. So we shouldn't tell them that, okay, now you have 2 hours to complete the task, but we can divide this task into shorter parts and give some time units for completing that. We can divide the task into a few smaller ones. That's what I've already said. And we can organize many breaks for such people. I told that they have problems to concentrate, but if we offer them some breaks, then they will have a chance to concentrate and then to have some refreshment and concentrate and refresh. Very good idea is physical exercises while working. And once again, that is the rule not only for ADHD sufferers, but for everybody, especially while distance learning and teaching. So physical activity while working is something very useful and important. And here what is suggested in case of ADHD people is to use lists, to use plans, post-its, to write down reminders, timetables. So something that gives a schedule for a day or a week, something which is a kind of path of what should be done in which order and at what time. And the last group, these are Asperger syndrome sufferers. This group is not that obvious because I guess we don't know much of them. So let's have a short revision of the difficulties they may have. So I will remind you that Asperger syndrome sufferers, they may have a difficulty in the following areas. First of all, they may have problems with interpreting instructions. So for such a person, it is not that obvious that they understand what is given. They may have problems in noisy situations because they cannot concentrate. They will have problems in unstructured situations. It will be problematic for them to start work and to organize their tasks. Organizing themselves and their belongings is also problematic. It would be difficult for them to listen to multiple instructions. Coping with changes, as I said, the room, times, workmates, if it changes, it is a big challenge for such a person. Different distractions are problematic for them. Interpreting abstract instructions, focusing on the important part of instruction is a problem, and motor skills. Well, as a good example, I will tell you about one of many of my meetings with a student at the University of Warsaw. She was my bachelor student, so we met, we were discussing her paper. And what was typical for her was the way she communicated with me. So when we were sitting on the two sides of a table, and when she was speaking, she was looking at me and saying what she wanted to say. So the communication looked normal. But when the roles changed and that was me who was telling her what to do, then she suddenly turned her face and she looked. I had an impression that she looked at the wall and was reading some information that was on the wall. But because I knew that she is an Asperger syndrome 1, and I also knew that such people they cannot use two communication channels at once, so they can listen or look. They cannot do both things at once. The fact that she turned her head meant that she was concentrating on what I was saying. But the very first impression was that she was just rude and she was more interested in my notes on the wall than in what I was saying. That is also only the example of the problems. If we don't understand the real reasons and the real situation, we may harm such a person. What are the strategies that we should use in such a situation? Fortunately, there is some list of links, and I will try to present the more useful ones. So first of all, we should keep instructions brief and precise. What does that mean? That means that we should use simple, concrete language, that we should write instructions and not say them, but write them. So written instructions are preferable. That we should confirm that the person has understood. So at the very end, we may ask some questions to make sure that the person understood, or we may try to ask the person to summarize what was said. And we can use peers or workmates to provide their cues. The second strategy says that we should give the person time to process the instruction. We should make sure that the attention of the person was paid and that the person got enough time to absorb instructions. So we should not be in a hurry when communicating with such a person. If practical, we should make use of visual cues and procedures. What does that mean? It means that a written schedule or task sheet is preferable to verbal instructions. It is also advised to use visual cues and instructions, to color code the instructions, to allow them to mark off each task as it is finished, to point to starting place or show an example of what we are requiring. Well, I have a friend whose daughter is Asperger syndrome 1, and well, what they do at home is just a written schedule of every day. So the girl, she is 9 years old. She has a schedule for every day, and the important parts of the schedule are highlighted. So that way of pointing to the important parts of the schedule is used, and it really helps. It is also advised to break work into smaller steps. So that rule is common for dyslexic students, for ADHD students, for Asperger syndrome students, and probably for the majority of us who don't suffer from any of these developmental disorders. So it is just useful to break work into smaller steps, sometimes, of course. What about communication problems that Asperger syndrome sufferers may have? So first of all, they may have a foreign or odd intonation. And if we know that the person is an Asperger syndrome 1, we should not treat that as something odd. We should just accept it. So a foreign or odd intonation. Such a person may show concrete interpretation of something or of what we said. They may show unusual linkage of thoughts. So sometimes the way they understand the world can be surprising for us, but for them is something obvious. They may be confined to narrow topics of conversation. So that is the example of the school student who wanted to talk about London architecture. I have also a friend whose son is Asperger syndrome 1, and for example, he is focused on a Rubik's Cube, and he just wants everybody to teach, he wants to teach everybody how to make a proper setting of the Rubik's Cube, and it is so hard to change the topic. So they are confined to narrow topics, and it is quite complicated to stop them talking about that. They may feature learned phrases in particular situations. Very often they show misinterpretation of what was said. Very often they hear only the beginning or end of an instruction or comment. And that is why it is so important to make sure that they understood everything, because very often they concentrate only at the beginning and the end of our instruction. They are not able to interpret the real meaning of colloquialisms, of metaphors, of similes, of sarcasm. And that is why our language should be simple, and we should not use idiomatic expressions and that type of language phrases. And they may have feelings of inadequacy and isolation from peers because they cannot understand what is happening. So what to do with these problems? Well, it is advised to use visual cues where possible. So try to explain different things in a visual way. If we want to make a joke, we should explain to the person, okay, that is a joke, I am joking. We should reassure that it is okay to be wrong and be supportive in such a situation. So such a person probably doesn't really understand there is nothing wrong in making mistakes. So we should be supportive and should explain that to the person. We should keep our language simple and direct, because we have to remember these people understand our phrases in a bit different way. And as it was said, they may concentrate only on the beginning and the end of our phrase. We should talk through situations, so probably showing some situations, just the examples of situations would be the best way to make the people understand what we want to say. And we shouldn't use any sarcasm, because it will not be understood by the person. The person understands the language literally. When talking about social skills, there are also special groups of problems, and we talked a bit about that. So the big problem for Asperger syndrome when talking about social skills is that they do not know how to behave, even though they may know they are different and do want to interact. So it happens that they know they just behave differently. They want to take part in some community, but they just don't know how to behave. They don't know how to do that. So the problems they very often suffer from are the following. So they don't understand rules of social behavior. They very often don't know that in such a situation they should behave in such a way. They may talk about inappropriate subjects. So it may seem that they are out of nowhere in our talk. They just start different topics not related to what we wanted to talk about. They may lack empathy. They just don't understand the behavior of other people, and they cannot imagine how the person feels in a particular situation. They can be very outspoken and tactless, so they just say what they think. They are very direct in that. They may develop a fixation on certain individuals. So that is not only that they may focus on a thing, on a topic, but they may also focus on a certain person, on a certain individual. They may have a strong sense of justice, but see things in black and white terms. So something is black or something is white. There's nothing in the middle. That's sometimes the way of understanding the world. Because of all that, they may have difficulty making friends. So very often people just don't understand such behavior, and they don't want to make friends with Asperger syndrome ones. I will add here also sometimes strange behavior of the parents. In my school, when such a person just becomes a student of our school, very often it happens that parents make a special list of types of behavior of a person. They instruct teachers how the teachers should react in a particular behavior. But for some reasons, the parents don't want anybody else to know about the problem of the child. Well, sometimes I cannot really understand that, because I see that in the class, if the if the classmates knew about the problem, probably they would understand, or at least they would try to understand, why an Asperger syndrome person behaves like that. If they don't know that there is something wrong with the person, there is some kind of developmental problem, they just treat such a person as an odd one. But for some reasons, the majority of the parents, they just don't want the classmates of their son or daughter to know about it. And that also results in difficulty making friends. They may have problems with the idea of personal space. So keeping the distance and understanding of personal space is difficult for them. They may misinterpret the behaviors of peers because they just don't understand the social behavior, the body language. They definitely may dislike being touched. They can appear naive and are vulnerable. And as I said, they don't interpret, they don't understand body language or facial expressions. So when we need to communicate with such a person, we just should forget about body language, about facial expressions, because even if we use them, it will not be understood. And they may have poor conversation skills. So as you can see, the list of problems is quite long. So once again, let's try to answer the questions of what to do in such a situation. How can we help such people? First of all, we should try to debrief situations by discussing what he or she could have done. So explaining, analyzing in a retrospective way what could have been done. We should encourage self-control by providing a timeout period. So definitely we should try to distress and relax, to help such a person distress and relax without any social expectations or demands placed on a person. It is a good idea to use written reminders to support proposed actions. And we should be aware of how vulnerable the person may be to peer pressure and being set up. And that is something that is related to what I said about the parents of such secondary school kids. If the group of their peers knew that they are just a bit different, that they are more vulnerable, probably their behavior would be different, and that would influence and somehow help Asperger syndrome ones. Okay, to conclude about Asperger syndrome, I would like to say that definitely Asperger syndrome ones need consistency, need predictability, need a calm and controlled supervisor, and definitely an organized workplace. If we make the workplace organized, then definitely it would be better for such a person. Well, I also said that I have an impression that although in Poland many people understand the existence, understand that there are people suffering from Asperger syndrome, for example, there are not that many who know how to behave, how to react. Well, me myself, I was a very good example of such a situation, because on one hand, I have the background, I know what to do now. But when I started my teaching career in the secondary school and I met my first Asperger syndrome person, my impression was that it was just a rude person who didn't know how to behave, and nobody taught her how to behave. And only later it turned out that she was an Asperger one. And to make the teachers understand and help such people, we were trained and we were given a lot of examples of possible behaviors of such people. And I must admit that only that was the moment that I changed my attitude and just started understanding more. What I also want to say is that here at the University of Warsaw, we have a special unit which is for people with different developmental disorders, because at the university, of course, we have such students, but they are adult people, and some of them, they just don't want to admit that they have some certificate proving some developmental disorders. There is also the group of people who suffer from some problems but have never been diagnosed. And there are also some people who think that there is something wrong with them, but they don't really know what. So the unit that was launched some years ago is organized to help such people. And very often, if they decide to use the help of the unit, they are given kind of special certificate from that unit. And in that certificate, there is the information of how we as teachers, academic teachers, how we should organize, maybe not the lectures, but probably the materials, how we should behave towards such a person, what we should do during the exam session as to make their chances better, as to help them to behave in their natural way and achieve proper results. But the problem is that this unit is not that popular, although it exists. Not everybody wants to go there, not everybody wants to ask for help. But if somebody finally decides, usually they are quite satisfied with that. And just to sum up, I want to say that I want to repeat the things that I started with. So we never know who we address, especially now when there is the distance learning and everything is done online. We don't know the people. We very often cannot see the people, so we just know nothing about them. That is why from the very beginning, it is better to prepare for the situation that we may be addressing those who suffer from some developmental disorders, or just don't like when on the slides there is too much information. So all the rules that I presented are of universal character, and they can be used everywhere. And I am sure that if we apply them, the communication process will be more effective, because they just help everybody, not only those who have some problems. And from that point of view, I think that it is just useful to know them and just to try to use them. Okay, so I think it is all from me. I will try to switch it off. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much.